y'all. Welcome to the Relax series. I need to invite our friend, Carol. You think they'd let you do this beforehand, right? Okay. She will join us. Ooh, and you know what I should do? I should probably put my AirPods on. Hi, good morning.
Hi. Oh, that worked easily. I was not even really ready.
I never have either.
Just a bit.
Connected. Yay. All right, we're in business. How are you doing?
That's what you just said.
Oh, shoot. It did just go in and out. How are you doing this morning?
Oh, good. Really good. Actually.
Yeah?
Yeah.
When the cat's away, there we go.
Well, it's funny you should mention that. My husband just went away this morning, so it's like, not that he's at all difficult to live with, but, you know, with the pandemic and everybody working from home, it's just nice to have some space where you just, you know,
Right.
the house to myself for a day or two.
Yeah, I agree. Those introverts of us need a little
for sure. Yeah.
carved out space.
We're both introverts, so he closes himself into his room, and I'm, in my own room. But yeah, it's just nice to do what you want to do and eat when you want to eat, and just occasionally have some time to yourself. So
yeah, I get that. Okay, well, you want to welcome yourself? I don't know if most people know who you are, but why don't you introduce yourself to whoever is watching, and then we can just kind of go from there.
Sure. Okay, so I'm Carol Robbins, and I teach movement. I've been teaching movement for, since about 1999. So whatever that is, 21, 22 years, something like that.
Yeah.
I started off teaching Pilates. I have a Pilates certification, a yoga certification, and some other things that, kind of fell by the wayside. And then the reason we know each other is from working with Katie Bowman. So 2012, I discovered her and started working with her and certified, and then became staff for Nutritious Movement and helped mentor some more students through the course. And one of them was you, and we worked together and became friends.
I know.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, I like, selfishly, I'm kind of excited because I just get to hang out with you. So,
anytime.
On my own time.
Yeah.
Is there any, and you're coming to us from Canada?
Yeah, I'm in Toronto. And up until this, last year and a half, I worked with local people mainly and did online workshops and things like that. But mostly it was just live locals. So it's been really awesome to be able to reach a broader community and work online. And it's been so successful that I'm going to stay with it, and I'm not going to have a live studio anymore.
Oh, really? No kidding.
Yeah. Well, I have a membership with Movement, like regulars that come and we hang out, and it's still a community feeling. Like, it still works. I don't have to be in the room to touch them or to see them. Like, I can teach them just as effectively. We see each other. There's always a time where we can talk before and after. They can get feedback during. It's good. It works fine. And I have people who I met through working with Nutritious Movement mainly, who are now part of that membership, which, they wouldn't have been able to do ordinarily. So what I'm doing this August is I'm trying to put together a new website, because right now all I'm doing is live Zooms with those people.
Right.
But I've kept the recordings. So now I have like 60 recordings.
Right.
And I was like, what am I going to do with these things? So I'm building a website to put all the and I'll be able to offer a membership to anybody, the way people do, where you just pay a monthly subscription and you can do your classes on your own.
That's great. So I'm going to record this and I'm going to send it to you, and then hopefully you can add it to your site if anybody would like more information. Okay. So today's topic, I'm calling this series Relax. I was trying to be clever, and then whatever. RE, also because we teach restorative exercise, I feel like the RE is in a lot of the stuff that we do anyways, but also I do think it is a moment to reevaluate why society really does glorify hypermobility, all the fancy poses we see. And I think being on a medium like this, it's like we're inundated with it, right? And then LAX, because that was Katie Bowman discussing how the term is actually laxity versus mobility for hypermobility. So it's just a little teaching moment. Plus the word relax made a lot of sense, because I do feel like there's a nervous system connection to all this as well.
It's brilliant.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Me trying to be clever marketing. So are you hypermobile?
Yes. I've never had an official diagnosis from, a physiotherapist or a doctor or anybody, but I would say that I'm hypermobile, but probably on not the extreme end of the scale. I have enough symptoms that it seems obvious to me that I probably would get a diagnosis of Ehlers-Danlos hypermobility.
No kidding.
Yeah, I think so. So, and it was one of those things that I didn't know for a long time. Like, I just thought it was like some weird personal flaws.
Right.
And it was like years ago, I still have social anxiety. It tends to get better as you age, but I didn't know I had one. I just was weird, right? Like, I thought, well, I'm weird. I'm different from anyone else. And then one day I was online and I saw this thing, and it was describing a list of symptoms of social anxiety. And one of them was so bizarre, and I thought, oh, that's me. I have that. And it normalizes it for you, right? So like the symptom that I'm talking about was a fear of signing your name in front of others. Like, that's how it was kind of like really narrow and specific. And it was like, oh yeah, like, back in the day, you'd go into a bank and you'd have to sign
right
in front of the teller. Like, stuff like that. I would get the pen in my hand, and then I'd just be like shaking. And then I'd think, oh, the teller's going to, they're going to think I'm stealing somebody's money because I'm so nervous, right? And that would make me more nervous. So that was one of those symptoms that I was like, oh, I have this thing. It's great. Now I know it's not like there's more people. And it's been like that with hypermobility. It's like, all these weird things that I just thought were personal flaws are actually part of something that is collected together in a group of symptoms that they call a syndrome, right?
Right.
So that's
incredible. Nice. I mean, I love that. That's a great analogy, that it just sort of is like it just kind of lumps everything, all these descriptors, into one sort of category. And then, it gives you almost a sense of relief.
Yeah. It normalizes it. It makes it seem like it's not normal, but at least you're not alone. It's not some like, why am I the only one with really baggy knees,
Yeah, no, I get that. So do you end up teaching a lot of hypermobile people, or what has been your experience?
Not specifically. My clientele tend to be like, I'm in my early 60s, and most of my clients are, I would say, 55 to 70, something like that. And there's always people that are outside that, but I would really love to start to target people who are like the 40 to 55 group, because that's kind of before the shit hits the fan, right? And it's like, if you're gonna wait until then you're looking at like, oh, now I've got to manage all these things. But if you could get people before the things, then that would be a good group to have. But I tend to attract people my own age and my own so that's what most people end up teaching, is people that have some similar things themselves.
Right. So I was gonna say, what's funny is like my population is more probably your demographic, and they just all tend to be hypermobile and just didn't know it. And I didn't know it initially, and all of a sudden it's almost like every woman I was working with, I was like, this is interesting. So go figure.
I don't find that mine are typically, but when I did the mentors for Nutritious Movement, that was when I started working with a lot of teachers. Yeah. And, from mostly yoga and Pilates. And a good many of them were hypermobile. So that's when I really started. I've always been able to manage my own symptoms, and with Katie's help and other teachers that I work with. But as clients, those were kind of my first large group of a collected group of those people with the similar symptoms.
But I do think having your own symptoms just gives you an extra empathy and an eye for it too.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think that's
absolutely.
kind of a biggie. Yeah. Right. So in your own world specifically, and you can address like what's worked with some of the teachers that you've worked with, like maybe like at the beginning when you found some of these like little, like, I don't know, interesting flaws, quote unquote flaws in your body, or just sort of movement patterns. What did you, if you can even think back, like what kinds of things did you attempt to try to do to help kind of like solve the problem or fix whatever might have been going on? And then like, what have you sort of learned that's actually effective and works for you today? And you can pick like a body part, you know, because obviously hypermobility does not necessarily systemically affect every joint of the body for some people, but if there's any areas, and you know, specifically, I know you did a great one about the elbow. So if you don't want to talk about your elbow, that's fine. But yeah, do you have anything specifically?
Sure. Well, the elbow talk came because I was talking with Kirsty Grossart, who's a gymnast and a handstand coach here in Toronto. And so we know each other. We actually met at the yoga conference one year, and we've just stayed in touch. And she has cats and I have cats, so we have a lot in common. Anyways, she's hypermobile and she has hyperextended elbows, and I used to as well. I still haven't one, but I had a injury on this one, so it no longer fully extends. So she wanted to talk about elbow hyperextension. So there's a whole 40-minute talk on YouTube on her channel, which is
we'll link to it somehow.
Okay, perfect. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's interesting to listen to, because I talk about where that comes from and how you can't really help it. Because one of the things that is always suggested to people with hypermobile elbows and knees is just to keep them bent a little bit.
Right.
And that didn't work for me because it wasn't specific enough.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And it's like, well, all the time, when you're weight bearing, when you're not weight bearing, when you're
right.
You know, and when you're thinking of knees, in ballet, for example, when the leg is in the air, a hyperextended knee gives you more height of the foot.
Right.
So it, you know, it's kind of falling out of favor now, but it used to be kind of like encouraged. It's like, if you're not weight bearing, just go for it. And then when the leg comes down and you're weight bearing, you have to be ready all of a sudden to be stable on that knee. So just bending the knee a little bit is something that is given to everybody, right? And it's not specific enough. And so one of the things I love about nutritious movement work, restorative exercise, is that we are trained to look at the relationship of one joint relative to the other joints around it in a varied amount of circumstances. So it won't always be one specific cue, right?
Right.
And so yes, you can do that when you're standing still, but what happens when you're walking? Right. What happens when you're, I don't know, doing some other exercise like bending over, or just movement? So that wasn't really helpful. It's just like that kind of blanket statement of just bend them a little bit.
Okay, good. Still going.
If we're talking about joint hypermobility as opposed to all the other stuff that can happen, and we can talk about that too if you want. But that's kind of what movement teachers are more like. If somebody walks into your studio, they're probably not an extreme case, right? Like those people would be walking into a physiotherapist or a doctor's office. So the people that are coming to you for help are probably your main thing isn't going to be like their hernia or their pelvic organ prolapse. It's going to be their joints and the stability of their joints. So you're working with. So what I usually do is I educate people as to where, like if you're hyperextended, I actually have like anatomical models that I will show them, and I'll show them like when your knee or your elbow is hyperextended, this is what's happening to the tissues around it. And if you bring it forward, it feels bent, but it isn't bent. So it's straight. So you're essentially centering the joint, which is different than bending it. Although to your mind, it's going to feel bent because your central nervous system will always default to the way you habitually move, or the way that's easiest, which is usually the way you habitually move. So any change feels wrong. And it's kind of like your central nervous system is the friend that is the bad influence, right? Always elbowing you and going like, oh, come on, you want to party. So you are like, oh, but I just dying to take my knee back there. because that's what feels good. That's when I feel like my ligaments and my tendons are loaded and I'm using my muscles. Like, it's ironic, but that's not what's happening, right? You're just kind of passively leaning on stuff and compressing stuff and pulling stuff in one direction and pushing it in the other. So when you teach people, like, if you just center your condyles on the tibial plateau, that's what a straight knee feels like. Then they can recognize that. I usually cue that from the tibial tuberosity, and I'll just say, just bring that forward, because then it's not so much in their mind connected to the hip flexion. Because if you just say to somebody, bend your knee, they'll flex their hip. Right. So now they've got two wrong things going on. And it works. Like, if you're lifting a weight or something, it works. It's going to keep them safer, but it doesn't really educate them to what their central nervous system, to what neutral is.
Right. I mean, I think you probably came in contact with people that I did very early on in our teaching career. And then as soon as you put them standing and say, like, a press down on the lat bar or something, they immediately bent their knees. And then you would sort of go, like, well, why are you bending your knees? And then some trainer at some point in their lifetime had told them to always bend their knees whenever they're standing. And here I am 20 years later, and these people are still doing it. And I'm sort of like, why is that, like, just sticking in their brains? I don't know. It's just fascinating. I don't know if you come across that much.
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah. Depends on their background.
And they all went to the same workshop and are spewing the exact same thing.
Well, that's probably what people like. It seems almost like hypermobility is a trend or a fad. It's like, oh, everybody has that now. But it's like, I think everybody had it before, but we just didn't name it. And now that we're recognizing that it is a thing, and that there's a proper way to address it, and not just like, oh, this person isn't working hard enough, they're not strong enough, I'm just going to tell them to bend their knees because otherwise they're going to buckle and hurt themselves under this weight.
Yeah.
So in working with people, it also kind of depends on what you're doing with them. So if you were a Pilates, like I used to teach Pilates, I don't anymore, but if somebody were on a reformer doing footwork, if you're hyperextended, the distance between the bar and your hip is decreased because the shape is like this, right, of the leg.
Right.
So when you bring the knee up, it actually moves the hip further from the bar. So one of the cues I used to use in that was to keep moving, to keep opening the spring.
Right.
Because it's possible to stop the carriage and then push the knee down.
Yep.
Which is just like this, right? It's all that buckling. But if you're like, here's your foot, here's your hip, this is your knee. And if you're moving this apart and you keep moving and you keep opening the spring, you're going to stop there. Because if you keep going, you actually will move back towards the bar if your knees go down. So if you can kind of cue people just to keep that length, then that's what keeps them safe in that circumstance and will help strengthen them in that range of motion.
I love that. That's a great cue. That's a really good cue. And then you can apply it to standing too, right? That you feel like, you're never just kind of like shrinking. Because if you go into that hyperextension, you do sort of drop in height a little bit, and versus like trying to maintain the length. That's good. I like that one. Do you have any other just like maybe more layman practical tips for people with hypermobility, or just kind of things that you might do throughout your day that you think about? And I think it's going to be probably more like you think about it more than you're actually doing. But
well, I'm more aware now of kind of like, it's when I feel the laxity happen, the alarms go off, so it's more obvious to me. So if I'm teaching and I'm sitting, or just if you're sitting around, because I sit on the floor, I'm not one of these teachers that has a studio and then has a home that's different than my studio, because my studio is my home. So I'm always on the floor. I'm always, doing this stuff. But if I bolster my hips up, then my knees can hyperextend if I'm sitting with my legs extended. Like, let's say you're in a V-sit or, legs straight out in front. So I always keep something nearby, like a half dome or a folded blanket, and I just will pop that under my knees. So if you're hypermobile, you just really want to let go and let everything, like let the floor support you, and you'll go into like, there's rotations. It's not just like, we know that if there's a hypermobility in the knee, it's not necessarily just a sagittal plane hypermobility. There's a rotation involved in it because you're displacing the tensions that would normally stop your knee. Mm-hmm. So you're allowing the knee to go, the joint to go further because you're displacing what would normally break it. B-R-A-K-E, stop.
Yeah, like stop it. Yeah,
like stopping a car.
Yeah.
So when you are, I forget what I was saying now. So when you are sitting, there's a tendency to kind of let those rotations happen. So your lower leg rotates and your foot, what's it called? Plantar flexes. And so I try to correct those things too by bolstering. Mm-hmm. So it almost seems counterintuitive, or for somebody who's very flexible and can sit with their knees on the floor, to not do that, right? Again, it's your central nervous system going like, well, you're stopping yourself before you need to. It doesn't feel right. And you won't like it because it's like, it's not meeting those end ranges that you're so, like it's always the hypermobile people that are like, oh, I need more stretch. You know, it's like,
yes.
So you really, there's a big learning curve in terms of, you're going to enjoy this someday, but for a while you're going to hate it. So just bolstering stuff, keeping stuff around you so that you're kind of keeping yourself a little bit out of those end ranges.
You actually, I have to say, sorry to interrupt, when we were doing our training together, I had a private with you at some point. We were talking about legs on the wall, where you like kind of scoot your butt up against the wall and then sort of straddle. And that's always been like my nemesis, even through gymnastics, where I was always like having to do over stretches where the tendons on the like inner side of my knee, the medial side of my knee, I would stay in the position and be fine. But as soon as I came out of it, I would get this like searing pain on my inner knees. And you were the one who was like, yeah, just put like some stools or chairs or, you know, something to kind of prop my legs up. So even though I was kind of in my end range, I was being supported in that end range. So I wasn't just like hanging on my inner knees, which I didn't even realize I was doing until I would come out of it. Because I think, we get this impulse to like want to stretch and move. And then, it's not exactly what our body truly needs. I think
you bring up a good point there, because you have end range and then there's gravity working on those soft tissues that may, you know, the connective tissue may not be as structural as it should be. And if you're just letting gravity act on that for 5 minutes, then you're going to get more. So if you go to the end range of your, like, you know, what feels like, okay, this is good. This is a good range of motion and I'm feeling it. And then stop yourself there manually, like physically, then you don't get that creep.
Right.
So that's the danger of like hanging out there. And it feels great. Like I love doing it, but again, not great for me.
Okay. So you bolstered, what else?
So let me see.
I think the red flags are really the biggest component. I think you're in touch with your body enough that you sort of know when you're going into that red flag zone. Like there is something intuitive that sort of kicks on. And I think that might be the disconnect that the general population doesn't have, is that like, oh, this is okay. This is my safety range. And then that's going a little beyond. But that's something you have to learn. That's not something that takes decades, I think.
And it's hard. Like, it's easier to give people tips about how to be when you're not moving. It's harder to say like, well, this is how you should walk and this is how you should move, because you know, there's no one right way to do something. But I often see young, usually women, standing, you know, because as you say, like we have an eye for it, we're always looking at it or for it, standing with their knees buckled in and then walking like that. So when you kind of fling your your hips are going side to side and you kind of fling your foot forward and then you drag your heel back and then just buckle back into your knee. Do you know that kind of gait that I'm describing?
Yeah. It's kind of, it's like kind of model walk-ish, except for like,
really
because there's
extreme.
that sort of, Yeah, because it's like this, like, I know what you mean, that pull back of the foot.
And it's almost like a buckle each step in the back of the knee. So I remember once a teacher explaining to me, when you see that, it's because there's no eccentric hamstring. So I thought, I've been thinking about that. So one of the exercises I really like to do is from the RE repertoire, which is hip hinge, which is just standing on the plumb line and then bending at your hips, right? So you're just bending in the middle of your body forward. And you usually put your hands on something to stop that. I'm just going to hang out here on my ligaments for 5 minutes, right? So you put your hands on something, so it's like a bolstering for your hamstring. It stops the range of motion at your hips, so you don't have to go to end range. And then you come back up. So that's the first part of it, is just, bending forward, coming back up, so that your hamstrings start to work. It's a nice functional movement because the hamstrings have to organize the weight of the torso. And they have to pull the torso back upright. And then you do that on one leg. And if you're hypermobile, that is the hardest thing in the world. Like, that's one exercise that is so simple, but when you are hypermobile, it is so hard. So if you're standing on one leg and bending over, you don't have to go very far and then come back up. And you're keeping the knee straight, which doesn't mean fully extended anymore, right? It means straight. Then you start to really be aware of the risks of, it feels very risky, because it feels like your knee is going to just buckle backwards. And that's what's happening when you walk. So that's my favorite exercise to teach people that are hypermobile, because now it's asking one leg's hamstrings to organize the full weight of the torso, as to both. If you have both legs, then you're kind of splitting the work between two legs. But when you're walking, you have one leg pushing you. So if you're on one leg and it's buckling backwards, it's a very ineffective way to walk, first of all. But it's also not really long-term sustainable for your ankles, knees, or hips.
Right.
Or lower back. So teaching them that helps cement in their minds where the knee belongs between the hip and the ankle, but it also strengthens the muscles that will keep it there.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty nice exercise. It's really hard to cheat on it.
Right. Yes. And then do you do things where, when people are sort of pitched forward, even if they're on two legs, like trying to sort of like bob the kneecaps up and down a little bit, just to kind of see if they're like locking back, or if they're able to kind of have more freedom?
It's interesting. I used to work in a Pilates studio that was in a larger dance studio, and mostly ballet, but some other dances. And then I wasn't a dance teacher, but I was always kind of curious about it. So between clients, I would often go and watch the classes. There was like a little window, and I could sit and watch the classes. And you'd see the ballet dancers. So these aren't kids. These were adults that were pretty, like they one of them was on one of those TV shows, Dancing with this, I don't know what it was, some dance show. Yeah. So like, they're good dancers. And they would, while they were dancing, they were just like unbelievably beautiful. And then they would stop. And while they waited for instructions, they would just like, it was like watching a tower collapse. And, they would just fall into their ligaments for a minute, and then the music would start and they'd lift again. So there's a real, there's a posture associated with hypermobility that is, there's actually a picture of it on one of my Instagram posts somewhere. It's from a ways back, but there's a picture of me standing. I've got like black shorts on and a black shirt, and I have overexposed on it lines, so you can see what's happening. So it's like the pelvis is forward, the thigh bone is angled back, the lower leg is angled forward, the foot is actually plantar flexed. You're in compressed lumbar spine. You're kind of collapsed here, forward head. So that stance is, that's pretty common, I'd say, in most hypermobile people, specifically women. Yeah. And let's face it, most people who are hypermobile tend to gravitate towards movements that use that range of motion. So, Pilates, dance, ballet.
Oh, I've got a question for you, kind of on the same vein. When those dancers would stand, how wide would their feet go? Do you remember?
Well, they'd be in turnout, so.
Right. Would they tend to stand with their feet wider apart, or would you see them with their feet relatively narrow?
I don't think they'd be that wide.
So the only reason I'm asking is I was an assistant for a teacher training a long time ago, and there was a professional dancer in our group. And girlfriend would walk. I mean, she would literally, when she would rest, she would open her legs like twice the size of, her width. And that was how she stood, hyperextended in that exact same thing that you just said. She wasn't necessarily turned out, but she would open her base so wide because I think that would lock her. Yeah. And I just thought we had a whole discussion about just standing either really wide or really narrow as like finding this, like, again, locking position so that you can just settle.
Yeah.
It was fascinating. I didn't know if you saw that in that dancer population either.
It's going back a few years, so I don't remember offhand, but I can see how that would be a strategy for stability if you're not using muscles. It's like buttresses, right? Let's just stick the hips in this way by moving the feet out, and then your pelvis can sit on something a little more stable.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Okay, so if you had to do some practical things, you're going to pay attention to how you're walking. Definitely bolster your end ranges of motion. When you prescribe things, I love the hip hinge too. For me, it's such a challenge. And then the single leg is like just brutal. Do you have any other like resources that you really love or that you sort of circle back to?
My resources aren't really public resources, so I can't really help like people with like, go to this website. Yeah. Obviously the work that we've done with Katie has been really helpful in establishing a grid that helps align people and teaches them not a static alignment, but a more dynamic alignment strategy. And then the work that I do with Irene Dowd, which is not as I don't see her as often, but I've worked with her or one of her assistants for many years.
Yeah.
And she works with a hypermobile population. She teaches dance at Juilliard. So she's always kind of teaching to that population, even if she's teaching regular. She usually just works with teachers of other modalities. So most of them are hypermobile, but definitely her dancers are more so her students. So that's really, working with her has been really helpful in understanding how to address that in terms of, she teaches arthrokinematics, which is movements of the joints, and ideokinesis, which is imagining movement that you already do in a different way so that your central nervous system can interpret that.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, it's a more like I thought it was just like, oh, we use these images and then it's like, no, it really is kind of more neurological. It's really interesting stuff. So that's something to look into. Ideokinesis, you can get books on that.
Yeah. No, that makes it really good. It kind of makes me think of like if you've ever like leaned up against a wall and then had your feet just like a little bit out in front of you, and so you're like telling your brain like, okay, to lean back, like what it feels like to feel that way, and then like come away from the wall, and then you still sort of feel like you're leaning back on the wall. It has that same like reset, I think, a little bit in your brain. Mm-hmm. We used to do a lot of visualization stuff in my dance program. So, but I think with the caveat, what you're saying is a little different. You're talking about visualizing it in a different way, not just sort of like performing a dance in your head. You're like trying to visualize changes occurring, which I think is a little different.
Yeah.
Very cool. I love that. I'm going to look into it. I love her work, as I've told you many, many times. So it's on my short list.
Yeah, I'm pretty lucky. So with it, because she's not an online person at all, so it's always been on in person, and when she comes to Toronto, or but now during the pandemic, one of her students has organized some workshops, so we've been working with her online. Yeah.
Oh, see, that's good. See, I have to say, there have been some positives, right?
A lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, apart from all the dying people and, tragedy, there's been some good change in terms of the environment, and, everybody can work from home, and it works fine. And we can survive our businesses, we can support local, and it's been a lot of.
Yeah. No, I agree. Well, thank you. Is there anything else you want to add? I mean, that was awesome. I think you gave some really, just the visualization when you were talking about just even like stacking of just sort of like, I don't know, that helps me. Just again, I think a lay person would be able to see that too. If you just, kind of visualize straight up and down versus like hanging back on your joints. I think that was really helpful.
Yeah. I think, get somebody who's, I can help you, and all you need is a mirror and somebody leading you through it. And that's really helpful. So, or get a book, if you can't. But I even find books like Katie's books, as good as they are, even people who've read them and interpret them in the way that they are habitually moving. It's really hard to be objective about how you are already. So it's really helpful to have someone else's eye.
Yeah. And I think exactly when I talk to my clients, I'm like, so there's this word and it's called proprioception, and it's like where you feel like you are in space, and you lay down and your head is like this, but it feels like it's straight, and you don't know that it's like crooked. And so until you have eyeballs, I have a story about my husband where he had a lot of like surgeries to the side of his neck, and I put him in Pilates with my good friend, one of my colleagues. And so my husband comes home and he's like, so Jeremy said my head is like this. And I look at him and I'm like, oh, I didn't even see it.
Oh, wow.
He literally is like this. And so he had a lot of like work done to then bring his head up right. But as I lived with him and I just didn't even see it. So I think having other eyeballs, not the ones you live with,
that's interesting.
On you, right? It's like body dysmorphic disorder, but I couldn't see my own spouse. So.
Well, it's like watching your kids grow. You don't see it, right? But when you see someone else's, you're like, wow, what happened? They're huge.
Yeah. Yeah. No, so, exactly.
You get used to it.
No, that was great. Yeah, totally. So I think hands down at the end of the day, I think people just need to have the eyeballs on them for sure. Just to double check that what they're feeling is what's actually really happening in their body. Yeah. Well, thank you. This is great. Thank you so much. Well, I hope people have something.
Again. Oh, there we go. You're frozen.
And like, of course my phone rings at the very end of this.
Okay.
But so I'm going to download this. I'm going to put it together as a series, but you are the inaugural person in the series. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the rest of it. It should be really, really interesting and a good resource.
Yes,
so.
Exactly. I'm choosing people who have hypermobility, EDS, specialists on EDS. My story is a little different because I actually probably wouldn't be considered hypermobile from like a clinical standpoint, but I trained in so many hypermobility modalities so early on that my ligaments became stretched as a result of the training and the conditioning that went along with it. Mm-hmm. So, cause I look at my daughter who like has my same structure and I'm like, she's not hypermobile. Like, nope, she's not, like, not at all. So I don't know. I'm curious to learn, especially learning that you can be hypermobile in certain areas and not others. And I think that's all really fascinating. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, have a good rest of your Wednesday. I can't believe it's only Wednesday. Enjoy your time alone.
Yes. Maybe I'll get some housework done.
Well, there you go. Okay, but I'll send this to you regardless. And I'm sure I'll see you online soon.
Okay. Thanks, Katie.
All right. Take care. Bye.
All right. Bye.